So, hello everyone. Welcome to this lecture on privacy technologies. I am Claudia Diaz. I'm a professor here at COSIC working on privacy technologies, and this is an introductory talk to the topic. Just a quick outline of the topics I'll be covering today. I'll start with some general introduction on privacy definitions and privacy models. And then I will move on to review some big families of privacy technologies, namely data protection technologies. I will talk about data anonymity and very briefly differential privacy, and then go on to anonymous access online, and then conclude. All right, so without further delay, let's start by thinking about what is actually privacy? How do we define it? And there are actually many different definitions, a lot of which are not coming from the technical world, but actually from the legal world. So the oldest definition is by Warren and Brandeis, who are two legal scholars in the US. They wrote a book called The Right to Privacy. It's considered one of the most influential essays in history. And they define privacy as the right to be let alone. So this is already from the end of the 19th century, and what is interesting about it is that this essay and this definition of privacy come as a reaction to technological developments, okay? And the technological development of the time is actually the photography and the press. So what Warren and Brandeis observe is that what they say that information that was previously hidden and private can now be shouted from the rooftops, because when you go to a party or to some high society event, before only the people who were there would be able to see you and see what you do, but then enter photography and the press, and now your pictures all over the newspapers, there are stories written about you, about what you did or what you did not do, and so on. So they think that this causes potentially a harm to individuals, and they establish this right to privacy, and they say that this is about protecting the privacy of the individual from invasion, either by the too enterprising press, the photographer, or the possessor of any modern device for recording or reproducing scenes or sounds. So it's really cute that this is from like the end of the 19th century. I mean, think of the modern devices for recording or reproducing scenes or sounds, and what was available at the time and what is available today, I think would be a complete privacy nightmare for Warren and Brandeis, right? Things have come a long way, and the privacy problems have not gone away, they have just become bigger. So if we move to the 1970s, there is a very influential definition by Alan Westin, who's also a legal scholar, and he defines privacy as the claim of individuals to determine for themselves when, how, and to what extent information about them is communicated to others. So this is very much introducing this notion of privacy as control over your own information, right? It is my information, I am entitled to decide who can get it, what they can do with it. A similar kind of thinking underlies the concept of informational self-determination that was put forward in a constitutional ruling by the German Constitutional Court in the 80s, where they talk about the protection of the individual against unlimited collection, storage, use, and disclosure of his or her personal data, and the capacity of the individual to determine in principle the disclosure and use of his or her personal data. Again, think about the 1980s and the kind of ICT that we had at the time, and the problems that this ruling was addressing has, again, only grown exponentially several orders of magnitude by now. But what is important about these definitions is that they kind of underlie some of the concepts underneath data protection, which is this idea of privacy as I have privacy when I am able to determine what happens to my data, who gets it and what they can do with it. Of course, it kind of assumes that you have a good negotiation power with the other party that is using your data in order to determine what they can and cannot do, which is a bit questionable, I would say, in today's environment where you're giving take it or leave it kind of decisions when you're, for example, accepting a privacy policy when interacting with a website or any other service. Also, there are complexities in this idea of my data, my decision, because it is not always so easy to determine who's the owner of data. if you and I have a conversation, who is the owner of that data? Is it you? Is it me? Is it both of us? If I take a picture of everybody in this room now, who is the owner of that data? Is it me because I took the picture? Is it the person who owns the camera? Is it the person who uploads the picture to some online service? Is it the people in the picture? It is not always so easy to say who is the person entitled to decide what should happen to data, because the data might actually relate to a group of people in different ways. So if we move to the end of the 20th century, there is another definition coming this time not from legal scholars but from social psychologists. And they define privacy as the freedom from unreasonable constraints on the construction of one's own identity. Okay, so this actually is quite relevant, particularly in social media platforms, in the sense that one can argue that the information practices around us shape our identity. So for example, if you are under surveillance, you might be kind of self-censoring or suffering from chilling effects that you're not actually, for example, sharing what you actually think about things because you're afraid of potential consequences given a surveillance environment around you. If you are subject to propaganda or manipulation online, this might also affect your identity and the way that you view yourself. But even beyond that, for example, if you're constantly, if the technological environment around you is telling you, for example, how you should look, this can lead to body image issues, as I read is the case these days for a lot of teenagers who are living a lot of their life online. And also it relates to privacy in basic practices that might become normalized in society. So for example, I hear that these days it is acceptable for teenagers to screenshot private conversations, private chat conversations, and then upload them to Instagram, for example, for other people to comment on those private conversations. If that becomes a normal practice, then that will change the way in which you relate to your friends and what you tell them online, if you think that at some point that might be published online, right? But of course, I mean, this also leaves many questions open. What are unreasonable constraints? What are reasonable and unreasonable constraints? And what is the construction of your own identity? These are very complex subjects. It's not that we have clarified so much what privacy actually is about. So one very influential definition is from Helen Nissenbaum from 2004. She defines privacy as contextual integrity. So what she observes is that privacy cannot be decontextualized, in the sense that whether privacy is violated or respected will have to do with rules about what is appropriate and not appropriate to disclose, depending on the context, which means the sender of the information, the recipient of the information, the transmission principle ruling this information. So for example, if I tell you something now in this lecture that is going to be uploaded online and that is being said in a kind of public environment, you probably think it's okay to go and then tell somebody else what I just told you, right? If, on the other hand, we are having a private conversation where people are kind of opening up in a more intimate space, you might understand that the transmission principle is not that you can then go and write a blog about it for the world to see. Similarly, it's appropriate for you to talk about your diseases when you're in the doctor's office. But then there is also the understanding that the doctor will keep confidentiality of that information. These appropriate contextual information norms can be explicit. In some cases, lawyers, doctors, priests, they have a duty of confidentiality for the information they receive. In other cases, they are shaped by kind of social practices, culture, and so on. But what is important here is that privacy is contextual, and I think that's a very good observation. Of course, what is appropriate or not appropriate might be a subject of controversy. Maybe what I think is appropriate is different from what you think is appropriate, and this definition doesn't solve that. It assumes that there is some sort of consensus, which might not always be the case. Other authors, such as Dan Solove, also a legal scholar, he tries to address privacy by saying, okay, when is privacy violated? What are privacy harms? And what can we learn about what privacy is by looking at when it is violated? He identifies 16 different types of harms that he classifies as those related to information collection, information processing, information dissemination, and invasion. Other definitions are coming from actually from legal frameworks, and there are many legal frameworks that are relevant to privacy. I'm only mentioning two here. GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. I believe you have a lecture this afternoon where you will get all the details. But there it really sees privacy as somehow a set of standards of what is okay, how it is okay to handle information of people, personal information. So it establishes rules such as you should be transparent about what you're collecting, and for which purposes you're collecting it and what you're planning to do with that data. You should have legitimate purposes for the collection. The data collection that you and processing that you conduct should be proportional to your purposes, and you should be accountable in case that you violate your duties towards the protection of those data. A different approach is taken by the European Convention of Human Rights, where Article 8 talks about respect for private and family life, home and correspondence. This is much more about protecting individuals towards overbearing states that might perform very intrusive surveillance on their citizens, thereby undermining their civil rights and freedoms. Okay, so very different approaches, even in the legal sphere. And perhaps more relevant for this lecture is from a security engineering perspective. What is privacy about, these privacy technologies? And I would say, I mean, this is often you will hear about, you know, the balance between trade-off between privacy and security. This is when kind of the properties that are important for stakeholders are put in contraposition, right? So you put in contraposition security for citizens towards security for the state, and there's where you have this privacy security trade-off. But I would argue that often privacy technologies are about security technologies for individuals, in the sense that a lot of these security technologies were created for corporations or for the military, because individuals didn't have computers at the time. Only big organizations had computers, so they needed to have security. And the age of privacy and privacy technologies kind of arrives when these technologies become widespread, and now each of us is having these informational assets that we need to protect and that we can be attacked with, right? So very often, I mean, at least to me, very often the difference between a security technology and a privacy technology is often not about the technology itself, but about the context of application. So if you're using an encryption algorithm for protecting military secrets, I would say that's a security technology, because the military doesn't have privacy. They have security for their assets. Same for a corporation. If what you're securing is the personal data of an individual, then that becomes a privacy technology. So very often it's not so much about what the technology does by itself, but it's about the context of application and whether it is being applied to individuals. And I want to say that everything that Frank said in his lecture about computer security applies here as well, in the sense that for privacy technologies you need to have a good model, that you understand what are the different elements, you understand what are the properties that you want to provide for different information assets, and then you understand what are your trust and threat model assumptions. Okay, what is this adversary trying to do, and what is the property you try to protect? This is basically applying to security as well as to privacy from an engineering perspective. And the properties we look at in privacy technologies are kind of mirroring or extending, most of the time, security properties. So we, of course, want to have confidentiality for our messages. If you're talking to a friend over an instant messenger, you want to have end-to-end encryption, like is provided by WhatsApp or Signal. And often you want to go further than that. So not only you want to protect the content of the messages, you want to, maybe you don't want other people to know who you're talking to at what time. So that would be about anonymity, that you're able to, you know, not be identified when you're conducting, you know, conversations or transactions. Or it can be about unlinkability, that if you do different things in different places, that they cannot be related as being the same person. Or you might want to be unobservable, meaning that you want to access a service without anybody being able to see that you are actually accessing that service. Some others are related to integrity and authenticity. So you want to be protected from impersonation, that people don't, you know, steal your money from your bank account. Or you might want to ensure that no party in the system is able to bias the system, manipulate the system, or make it come up with unfair outcomes for some participants, such as discrimination and so on. And again, availability as well. In the privacy world, when we talk about availability, is usually linked to censorship. So it is seen as censorship, the privacy property is seen as censorship resistance. That can be censorship towards publishing things online. So, for example, there is human rights violations going on, and you want to upload a video to, alert the world of what's happening, and maybe you are in an area where, there is a censor that wants to prevent you from doing that, but also censorship preventing people from accessing information, not just uploading. All right. So, basically, what has happened is that, as I said, why do we need now these security technologies for individuals when this was before it used to be just the realm of big organizations such as states or corporations? Is because in the last decades we have moved from mostly from living our lives in an offline world towards an online world, and this has changed, all kinds of our activities. When we had conversations face to face, now we have them over electronic means. Our documents used to be in some physical drawer that to get to them, somebody had to go to the drawer, open the drawer, and get the papers. Now they are in digital archives that can be accessed from a distance very often. Our payments with cash are very difficult to trace, so making profiles of people's financial activities was very hard. If you pay with credit card, means that there is some organizations that actually have your whole transaction history. Following somebody's movement is extremely expensive, but now we all have trackers that record our movements. Same for social networks, that the graphs are very public. All these interactions that we have with others give away who our associates are, and so on. So basically, when information used to be very hard to collect and to aggregate and to process, it has become now extremely cheap, and that gives rise to a different game in a way, right? So we are in a different reality in terms of the available data, the computing power that we have to extract intelligence from that data, and increasingly we are subject to information, automated decision making based on that data that will impact our lives. It will determine whether we have access to a certain deal or not, whether we have access to a certain service or not, whether we get a free promotion for some new product, or even more serious things, whether we get a job or admitted to a university. Increasingly, we are having these data-driven decisions that shift the decision-making power to algorithms based on data. So, of course, there is issues with algorithmic accountability. Who's accountable if those decisions are unfair? Is it the programmer? Is it the person running the algorithm, and so on? So you could say, okay, well, why should I worry about this? Okay, all my information is out there, but I have nothing to hide. I'm not really doing anything illegal. Why is this a problem for me, right? I am a compliant citizen. I don't see the problem. So what Solove, this is Dan Solove is a legal scholar. What he says, he has an article that is entitled "Nothing to Hide and Other Misunderstandings of Privacy." It's a very interesting article. And he says that the problem with this argument is that it assumes, it has an implicit assumption that privacy is about hiding bad things, okay? And he goes on to say that part of what makes a society a good place in which to live is the extent to which it allows people freedom from the intrusiveness of others. And he says that a society with a privacy protection would be suffocation. If you're constantly exposed, constantly being seen, constantly being judged, you don't have a space in which you can, just do your things without anybody knowing about it, this is suffocating. That's his argument. And I think it's important to keep in mind a difference between secret and private. So a lot of the things that we do in our daily lives are not really secret, like the fact that what you say to a friend, the fact that you're here now and you take this path to go to some other place, the fact that you're reading a certain book, the fact that you today maybe went to the doctor because you have a cold. All of these things are not necessarily secret. But the fact that they are not secret doesn't mean that you want them to be recorded forever, analyzed, compiled, and put into a machine that will make decisions that will affect you. It doesn't have to be secret for you to be concerned about that kind of information processing, okay? So don't think about just things that you absolutely don't want anybody to know. Just think about, what are the implications of having large-scale data collection practices. And a very interesting book that came earlier this year is called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. I encourage you to look at, there's some really good talks of her online if you're interested in the topic. Basically what she says is that we have entered since the early 2000s a new age of capitalism that she calls surveillance capitalism, and she says Google initiated it. And here in surveillance capitalism, she says we are not the product. This is, there's this famous saying, right? If you're not paying for the service, then you're not the customer, you're the product. She says we are not the product. We are certainly not the customer. What we are is the raw material, okay? So we are the raw material in surveillance capitalism. So first, surveillance capitalism claims human experience as this raw material that translates into behavioral data, okay? So this is anything from your vital constants that a wearable picks up, to your online searches, to your clicks, to your interactions with others, anything that is, all these activities that we have are being captured as raw data, behavioral data. Then this data is fed into machine intelligence. This is like the whole big data infrastructure. This is a manufacturing process that produces the product. The product is behavioral predictions. Behavioral predictions on what you will do next, okay? So that's a product that is sold to companies that want to know what you will do next, or want you to do certain things next, like spending money with their business. Okay, and then these prediction products are sold in a new type of market, the behavioral futures market. Okay, and this is the whole advertising ecosystem. And I believe Bart showed you this big picture of all this ecosystem. This is a behavioral futures market. It says, I believe this person will click in your website, will buy your product, okay? And then she goes on to say that it's not just about predicting, it's actually about influencing, okay? So it's about herding people in a certain direction to take certain actions that will, produce a good business outcome for those who are the customers of the companies that perform surveillance capitalism, right? In this case, it's the shops that, for example, advertise in Google, or in Facebook, and so on, right? It is designed to be opaque and to bypass our cognitive mechanisms, okay? It is specifically designed to be undetectable by you. You shouldn't be noticing that you are being manipulated in this way. And this is a quote that I found related to this work. It says that the Googles and Facebooks of this world are shaping an anti-democratic world in which every little detail of our online and offline lives becomes raw material in the production of predictive products that eliminate our freedom. Okay, so this is actually, I found it a very compelling exercise. It has implications in all kinds of realms. Certainly social media is being driven by advertising and therefore by surveillance capitalism. Obviously search or any means that we have to find information and products. She gives a very interesting example with Pokemon Go. So in Pokemon Go, basically, I guess you know the game, you basically have these monsters, it's kind of a hybrid reality virtual game, and then you have to go hunting the monsters to places, and there are places where the monsters grow and you have more probability of finding monsters and so on. So what they do is that the customers are actually physical businesses, like shops, pizza places, cafes, and so on, that would pay Pokemon Go to put beast, monster creation things in their location, right? So that means that customers will go to those locations to get the monsters, and since they are there, that increases the sales of the shop. They sell more coffees, more pizzas, and so on, because you're bringing customers to the door of those shops. So those are the customers. The product is us, the prediction that we will go there and buy something, and we are just, the raw material being used here. Of course, big implications for smart cities, because this is what smart cities are going to be about. Okay, they're going to be about herding people in ways that will be shaped by whoever is the customer of the technology, which likely will be the businesses in the city to a large extent. Okay, so I found that very compelling. The concerns are not only commercial. We know since the Snowden revelations a few years ago already that nation-state adversaries also piggyback on the surveillance infrastructure that has been put in place by corporate actors. And they get access to this information via, in some cases, collaboration from industry, so such as the PRISM program that would give an interface to the NSA to access private information of the people who are using these big services such as Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Microsoft, and so on. But also, I mean, the nation states also do it adversarially against corporations without their knowledge or consent, and this is how they were tapping into the Google internal data centers without Google even knowing about it. Okay, so this was kind of the introduction of why we need privacy technologies. So what do they try to do is that they aim to address or mitigate these privacy concerns. And the idea is to do that while still allowing us to enjoy modern world and modern ICTs. Because of course we can say, okay, we just throw it with the phone, we throw it with the computer, we go dark, you know, no more internet, and therefore we are safe. But I mean, that's not really the point. We want to have all these fancy and very convenient applications and services. We just don't want to have to give all our data in exchange for that. So there's a very broad range of technology-based solutions that try to address some aspect of privacy protection. I really have no time to cover all the ground in this talk, so I will just give you some examples so that you get a sense of what these privacy technologies do. So many of the technologies are aimed that you will hear marketed as privacy technologies are actually technologies that assist in ensuring compliance with data protection, with GDPR. Okay, so this is, for example, you should encrypt data at rest and in transmission. You should authenticate your employees before they are accessing personal data of users to ensure that they are authorized to access those data and they do so for legitimate purposes. You might have to log everything that happens with personal data in order to be able to produce, to make the information available to audits and show that no abusive uses of data have happened. You might have to have secure deletion of data to implement the so-called right to be forgotten. You might want to have things such as purpose-based access control that basically only allows the people in the organization to access data when they the purpose for which they want to access the data is actually compatible with the purpose for which the data was collected. And you might want to have in place all kinds of technologies to ensure that your privacy policies and your data handling policies are actually enforced. Okay, so often these are just general information security technologies that in this case can be applied by enterprises or by organizations that are handling personal data instead of being used to protect national secrets and so on. So in terms of the trust and the threat models, it's important to realize that architecturally the data controller, meaning the organization or the entity who's implementing these technologies, is completely trusted to secure the data. Okay, like if you're having authentication of employees for, you know, giving them access to your customer database and your customer details, you are trying to protect against malicious employees, but the organization itself is trusted to be interested in protecting those data assets, right? So the threat model is typically third parties, external actors, malicious employees perhaps, or errors. But if you are concerned about the organization by itself having a business model that is privacy invasive, as is in the case of this, you know, surveillance capitalism kind of industry, then it's important to keep in mind that you actually have no technological protection against the organization itself if they want to abuse your data for any illegitimate or unethical purposes. So of course here the protection that you have is legal. You can go to the Data Protection Authority, you can put a complaint, this can go to the courts, and you know, this is basically your enforcement mechanism, but technically they are able to abuse your data if they want to. And what is important here to keep in mind, I think, for these technologies is, are the incentives of the trusted party aligned with incentives of the data subject? Because if you're in a military context or you're in a corporate context, indeed, the corporation has a very strong interest in keeping safe their own information assets. unless they are infiltrated by the, I don't know, the competition or something. They have an interest. Same with a military organization, they have an interest in their own national security. Now, in these cases, sometimes you might have that the trusted party, that is the organization, has an interest that is not completely in line with the interest of the people to whom the data relates. And if you have a gap there, then maybe the protection you're obtaining is not quite as high as you would wish. So a lot of other work focuses, this is again quite in line with data protection. It focuses on consent, control, and access. So for example, you want to design your system in a way, you will advertise your system as being more privacy preserving when you have privacy friendly defaults. That by default, when you make a new account in this system, everything is very private, and then you have to, like for example, you make a new Facebook account, everything is friends only, and then you have to actually change things if you want to make them more open, right? So that's one strategy. Another thing you might want to implement is usable privacy settings that are easy to find, that people can understand, that they can configure, that they get contextual feedback to see what is the effect of changing a setting. This is, for example, the Facebook how do others see my profile button, and then you get a sense of how others see your profile. You can play with your settings and get a sense of the effect. Or the dashboards that allow you to do privacy management. I don't want this information to be used to target me for marketing, things like that. Again, I mean, in relation to security technologies, you have to realize that this is basically the kind of thing that a system administrator used to do. They would kind of set permissions, who can access which information. They would set the access control policy. This is basically now users having to do access control policies for themselves and their own data towards other parties. You might want to provide usable interfaces to exercise subject access rights. These rights are, for example, right of you have the right to know what information about you is being kept by an organization. So you should have a button that says, tell me everything you know about me, and download it, for deletion of accounts, for portability, and so on. You might want to make your privacy policies in ways that are understandable. So that might involve having user studies to see which wordings are actually understandable by people, that they actually get the right idea of what you're saying. Or you might want to assist users with privacy relevant decision making by having nudges or design artifacts that kind of push people into making the decisions that are privacy protecting rather than privacy invasive. So these are solutions that very much focus on user interface and user experience and user perception. A lot of the technologies that are put forward by, for example, Google and Facebook to say that they protect your privacy are in this kind of realm, right? Often the goal here is to make you feel comfortable, particularly in social media with respect to other people, with respect to your peers, right? So you don't want people to have problems with their family or with their friends because of information that was shared inadvertently, right? So you provide like this privacy controls to mitigate that. So the trust model here is again that the control is trusted to facilitate the provision of informed consent, the exercise of access rights, and the control over your personal data. You're again relying on this organization provided you with all the facilities, right? And what is the threats? What are you concerned about? Well, people making mistakes because they are unaware, because they don't understand how the system works, that they have a preference but the system is configured wrongly, or having undesirable outcomes like, for example, information about you being revealed to your family. So even though there's a lot of talk about transparency, transparency, we tell you everything so that you can make decisions, informed decisions, the truth is that there is very strong limitations posed by intellectual property, in the sense that to which extent can you make a decision about the implications of sharing a piece of data with an organization when you don't know what kind of other data sets they are combining it with, you don't know what kind of data mining algorithms they are using, you don't know what kind of decision-making processes they are actually having in place, right? So this idea that you can make informed decisions is undermined by the actual lack of transparency and the complexity, not just lack of transparency, but the overall complexity of the implications of your decisions. And again, you have no technological protection for malicious controllers that want to violate your settings. You say, I want them to be friends only, but then they actually have the physical power to make it more accessible. And kind of a flip side of trying to facilitate consent and control by users over the data is this whole thing of dark patterns, which is kind of the dark side of consent, which are features of interface design crafted to trick users into doing things they might not want to do, but which benefit the business in question. So this goes into the whole manipulation technology that is increasingly pervasive. We see this a lot with the cookies, for example. You go to a website and then now they have this obligation of having to get your consent in order to place cookies, right? So you get this banner, you want these cookies, and then you get, yes, it's okay, it's the button this big, right? And then if you don't want to say it's okay, you have here a tiny thing that says more information, right? So then you go to more information, and then maybe you have to do 10 more clicks until you can get to a place where you're able to say, no, I don't want the cookies. Okay, this is a dark pattern. It's basically, the design is done in a way that it will push you towards taking the action that is good for the business in question. Okay. Ryanair was very proficient at dark patterns to get you to get insurance and all of these things. It was impossible to see where you could take it off. Those are dark patterns. So, yeah.
So, how do they differ from nudges?
It sounds like yeah, that's a very good question.
Privacy,
yeah, well, dark patterns are definitely, I would say they're a type of nudge. They're a type of nudge that is basically crafted to bypass your cognition in order to get you to do something you don't actually want to do, but the other party wants you to do. So it's nudges in principle are seen as more beneficial because they tend to assist you in doing the right thing. Or making
benevolent creation nudges.
Exactly, but it's all based on behavioral psychology. Yeah. So, by the way, if you're interested in dark patterns, there is a summer school on privacy that is happening in the first week of September on dark patterns. It will have people from law, from social science, and from computer science discussing that, everything about dark patterns. So that should be very interesting. You're encouraged to check it out. Okay, so one of the big families of technologies that aim to support privacy are anonymity technologies. Okay, so what is anonymity? Anonymity comes from Greek. It comes from the prefix an, and the name, the word onoma, so means no name. Okay, nameless, to be nameless. That's what anonymous means. So what does it mean in a computer system? It means that we have some subject that is not named, okay? And what is this subject? This could be the person physically present, the device owner, the account owner, the entry in a database, the owner of a record, the writer of an anonymous text. It can be many things, this anonymous subject. And then we have a name, and this name can also take many shapes, like Claudia Diaz is one name, but I have many other names. I have my personal number in the university, my biometric can also be considered a name, the cookie that you place in my computer to recognize me can also be a sort of name, the key to a database, and so on. So basically, in anonymity technologies, what we are trying to do is to have a subject that we cannot attach a name to, okay? Oops. So not attaching something to a name is not just about that. It's not about just naming the subject and that's it. Typically, when we have a name, we will have a history that is attached to that name. We will have prior behavior, prior transactions, other things that we know about that name, okay? So when we are not connecting somebody to their name, it means we are also not connecting them to their past history. It means that we, for example, don't know what their preferences are, or we don't know what past transactions they did. And also we are not able to add to that history the current activity of the person, okay? And another thing that is important is that when we're talking about history and a lot of information that we have about somebody, it's not just the raw information that matters, it's also what inferences we can make from that information. Okay, that kind of enriches and gives meaning to what we know. And then maybe another important thing when we think about anonymity is that in kind of digital systems, we often don't think about anonymity as either I know your name or I don't, kind of a binary thing. It is rather that we know that there is a set of names in the world, and there is a set of subjects, and we are trying to connect of which of the available names of the people that we have in the country, or people who speak English, or people who are humans on Earth, which one is the one that we want to label. So we have kind of a closed set of people. That's usually how we think about it. And the size of this set is what we call the anonymity set. So which potential people you could be, right? So for example, if what we are trying to do is identify the writer of an online text, and the text is written in Dutch, for example, that would be already a much smaller anonymity set than if the text is written in English, that it has more potential people who could have been the authors of that text. Okay. So data anonymization is kind of seen as a privacy. Oh my God, I'm almost at the end of my time. Shit. Okay, I have to speed up. So
you can have my slot.
No, I shouldn't. So data anonymization is seen as a privacy panacea. Why? Because we would love to have the ability to do studies on data, extract intelligence from data, do epidemics, all of these things without endangering people's privacy. Now, this is very hard. Why? Because you would think that it's enough to just remove the name from a data set in order for it to be anonymous. Well, this is not the case. Already in the late 90s, Latanya Sweeney demonstrated this is not the case. This was a case involving the Group Insurance Commission. They wanted to release a data set for medical research, and what they did was that they removed the name and they published basically those kind of data. In principle, it was anonymized, but what Sweeney did was that she purchased a voter list, and in the voter list you would have a subset of attributes being shared with the medical database, in this case zip code, date of birth and sex, and that attached with the name. So what she found is that the triplet of zip code, date of birth and sex is unique for 87% of the census, so that becomes a quasi-identifier, meaning that if I look at this triplet, zip code, date of birth and sex in this medical data set, and then I go to the voter list, in many cases there will just be one person, and then I can retrieve that name and now put the name on the medical record that was supposedly anonymous. Okay, so she shows that removing unique identifiers is not enough, and then she proposes k-anonymity, which is a technique that is still in use today, that basically tries to generalize and suppress. So for example, they say, well, we remove the sex, the date of birth, we just leave the year, and the zip code, we just take it a bigger area, right? And now there's not only one person, it's not unique, you know, we have more people, so now you have maybe a set of 50 names or 100 names that you can attach to this medical record. Still, that has many problems because you have to kind of define in advance what is the information that will be available to the adversary, and that's not always possible. Now, you can say, well, that's kind of trivial, but what about, I mean, zip code, sex, date of birth, you can see how that's identifying information. But it goes much further than that. This is another work that was about a Netflix data set. Netflix wanted to improve their recommendation algorithm, so they released a data set with movies, ratings, and the date when the rating was input. The idea was that they would give this to researchers. The researchers would kind of do recommendations and then use this data set to test if the recommendations were good. Okay. So Netflix assured people that no customer information is present and you should have no worries whatsoever about your privacy being violated. So here the adversaries also use access to public information, in this case IMDb, which is another data set that contains the same information, movies, ratings, and dates, and also an account name in this case, right? So what they found is that if two people, if the same person has an account in both Netflix and IMDb, you will be able to re-identify them. Why? Because the universe of movies is so large that everybody is very unique. So the movies that you have seen and the days when you saw those movies is different from every other, very different from every other person. So if the same person is in two data sets, you will be able to correlate those data and put a name again on your anonymous record. Okay. So basically, a simple list of preferences, given that there is so many other data sets out there, is actually not anonymous. And with location data, it's even more complicated. Yves Alexandre de Montjoie, he showed that with only 4 points, 4 location points, you're already unique in a crowd, in the sense that if I take your location, just 4 points of your location in a data set, I would be able to, if I know that you were at home in the evening, at work during work hours, that this is the shop you go to and this is where your kids go to school, I will be able to re-identify the location trace and then learn all the other additional data points that are in there. And this is with hourly temporal resolution, not very fine grained. This is not GPS, this is like big areas, and even in that case is unique. So very difficult to anonymize location data. And you might have heard about the Strava Fitbit, where it would reveal the location of like CIA sites and the outline of military complexes, because the soldiers were using this Strava Fitbit that was uploading heat maps on the location traces of the users. Again, anonymized and aggregated, but if you're in the middle of Yemen, it's probably, and you see this kind of heat map, is probably not locals, is probably an American base, right? Because they are the ones using these devices. So basically what this shows is that there's a huge universal combination, there's a sparsity uniqueness, and data is therefore re-identified with noise, even with noise. So this has, again, implications for smart cities and IoT and any data sets that use data implicitly or explicitly. Okay, I'm gonna start rushing through a little bit. One alternative is to use differential privacy. This is, instead of modifying a data set, what you do is that you do privacy preserving computation. You add noise to the result of the computation, such that on the aggregate you get results that are kind of accurate, but you are not able to kind of pinpoint for an individual. It's too noisy to know what their data value was, or whether, or even whether they were part of the data set. And there are different techniques to achieve it. You might also want to be anonymous online, not just to have your, in the previous case, is your data that is in some data set and somebody wants to do something with that data and they want to anonymize it to protect you. In other cases, you are online and you want to access a service like a web page, for example, anonymously. So the way this works, in the classical security model, you have Alice and Bob and some Eve that eavesdrops. We cannot model anonymity in that kind of model. We need an anonymity model. Remember, you have the bag of names, so you need to have many Alices, many Bobs, and the property that you seek is that it's not possible to know which Alice is talking to which Bob, basically. So important considerations here is that you cannot be anonymous on your own. You need a crowd of people. And ideally, you want these people to be diverse, okay? Because if everybody that is using the anonymity system is doing so to go to CNN, then I already know if I see you accessing the anonymity system that you are going to CNN. So you need to have many different uses. And another important thing is that anonymity has many layers, and you can identify the individual with using many different information at many layers. So for example, your mobile phone might have a unique radio frequency fingerprint, or your IP might be identifying you, or you might have the fingerprints of the device or the software, or your writing style, or your behavioral data, and so on. This is not comprehensive, right? So leakage that enables re-identification, meaning de-anonymization, can occur at multiple layers. I'm going to skip through that. You will have some web tracking. Basically, the point here is to say that companies are actively trying to track you in the web. They are using cookies, they are using cookie syncing, they are using zombie cookies that are difficult to delete, and the goal, they are using passive fingerprinting techniques, and the goal is to be able to identify you so that they can name you and track you and aggregate you and then put you in this prediction machine so that they know what to sell to you and what ads to sell to you, which is the whole business model. So what can you do to prevent that? There's anonymous communication systems such as Tor that you might have heard about. The idea of Tor is that you have a distributed network of relays, 7,000 currently. First of all, you need to get information about these relays, their keys, their addresses, and so on. You get that from the directory authorities. And once you have that, you will construct a packet in layers. So basically, you start encrypting for your end destination, then for the R3, then for R2, then for R1. You do like an onion encryption, so in layers. And then when you send it through the network, the first router, the first proxy will strip the outer layer of encryption and forward the rest to the second. That will strip another layer of encryption, the orange layer, send to the third. That will strip the another layer, and so on. Okay? So this is called onion encryption. This functions like a set of VPNs, but it provides better protection because a VPN is a trusted service. One service here you have distributed, so it becomes difficult to trace connections. This protects you against malicious websites. It protects you against ISPs trying to monitor what you're doing. It protects you against malicious routers if they are not taking all of the path. But it does not protect you against adversaries that are able to see input and output, because this is just proxies that are forwarding. So you can still look at the time of initial connection, time of end connection, number of bytes per second, and that would have some kind of characteristic that you can correlate. So even this is protecting you against certain threats, but not all threats. If you want to have more protection, then you have to go to a technique that has more trade-offs, that will have latency, that will mix packets together in a way that makes tracing more difficult at the cost of additional latency. So I will move to, even if you're anonymous, I'm over time, so I'm just concluding now. So even if, one thing to just keep in mind these layers, even if you are using Tor to publish your tweets, to go to your anonymous Twitter account, you should be aware that your writing style is also unique. So if you want to be anonymous, it's not just only about how you access this service. Your activity and your behavior itself in the service might actually give you away. In this case, stylometry is actually very effective at identifying people's writing styles. Everybody's style is unique, and if you don't do anything to conceal your style, you might still be identifiable through that. Okay, so to summarize, defining privacy is actually quite hard. It's a very multi-dimensional concept. It's not only technical. And this is something that Frank said that I want to say again, that he said, when somebody says that the system provides security, don't assume that you know what it means. The same absolutely goes for privacy. When somebody talks about privacy or a technology that protects privacy, don't assume that you know what that means. Really ask what are the assumptions, what is the threat, and what exactly the system does. And then when looking at privacy technologies, some of these technologies are implemented by the kind of trusted controller. That's very nice, but you have to be aware that you're not protected against the controller itself. That can be a single point of failure. Anonymity is actually very hard to achieve, and it's kind of an open problem, data anonymity. And accessing anonymous services is important, that you cannot be the only one. You need a crowd of people, and that requires coordination with a community, and you need protection at multiple layers. So I'm sorry, I went a bit over time. I will be around for lunch if you want to have questions.